In an exclusive interview for members of the Women's Rights Network, Susan Smith from For Women Scotland joined WRN's Mary Howden to recount the extraordinary battle to hold the Scottish Government to account. They successfully secured the ruling from the UK Supreme Court that sent positive shockwaves across the globe. Susan also discussed what happens next and why we should all be considering legal action against organisations that fail to comply with UK equality law. It was a conversation that attracted a huge audience of WRN members from across the UK.
Hello, Susan. Welcome to our Zoom. It's so lovely to see you here. For those of you who, I can't believe there would be anyone on here who's not familiar with who you are, but this is Susan Smith, who's one of the directors for Women Scotland. She's also a director of Byra's Place, which is the sexual assault services that were set up on the back of our rape crisis centres here, thinking that men can be women. And you've also now a novelist in that you are in this wonderful book, The Women Who Wouldn't Wished. I'm just showing I've got a copy here. I'm showing off. So welcome. It's nice to see you.
Thank you. And it's a great book, so buy it if you haven't got it.
Well, I have not only that, I have the Kindle version as well, because I believe it was at 99p the other week there. So
it was, yeah, it was.
So thank you for joining us. And obviously, first question: how does it feel to be such a having introduced such a major event thing in feminist history? You know, the Supreme Court ruling. That must just feel like, not every woman is going to get to do any of that, and that's just fantastic.
Yeah, it's quite weird. It was a very surreal day, and walking out of that court and that bank of press photographers and all these people asking questions and flashbulbs popping, it was quite extraordinary. Hadn't really expected anything like that to happen. And after I saw one of my contemporaries from university had put something nice up about it on Facebook. And I thought, oh, that's nice. And then I went back and reread it, and he said, I thought he said this is one of the great achievements by one of my contemporaries at Oxford. And actually he went, this is the single greatest achievement of any of my contemporaries at Oxford. And I thought, well, considering some of them are prime ministers, that's pretty good.
That is pretty. That's something. When you write the book about it, Susan, that's got to be in there in the foreword, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So I thought we could maybe kind of take things back a bit, because it's been a long kind of passage certainly within Scotland, in getting to this point. And I guess that I always had this notion that you were one of the four in the kitchen in Marion's in Marion's flat, but in fact you weren't.
No.
So I was wondering how you came to be involved in it.
So yeah, I was not one of the original four women Scotland, which is a bit upsetting. But people say I am, so I'll take the credit. I think what happened was that after they'd made that decision, they then went out of the living room and said, right, we'll go forth and recruit. And so I was probably one of the first people then that Trina recruited. She sent me a message and said, we are doing something, are you in? And I said, yes, absolutely. And we had this social media group on Facebook, and we were all at sixes and sevens, and we didn't know what we were doing. We had no clue what anybody was. We didn't really know each other very well. People individually had people they knew, but it was, but we didn't know each other as a group. And most of us had never done anything like this before. And I think it was because it started off because sometime in the first week, there was a report about some of the stuff in schools. in the Scotsman, and I said, well, I'll write a letter to them. The letter didn't even get published, but it was a really good letter. So everyone was very impressed. And then we all met up, and they were distributing jobs. And Marion and I were both in Edinburgh, so she asked if I'd go and see some MSPs with her. And then they said, could I do Twitter? So I said I'd do that. And because of that process, it kind of evolved into, right, I was going to do the media. There were journalists in that group, but of course they all had to be very sub rosa. So they weren't wanting to put their name on anything. So we had to come down. Really, how it worked out was that we were the people who could put our name on things because the other people couldn't. And so that was, I suppose, in a way, how it fell out that I came to be one of the directors.
Well, we're very grateful that you did become one of the directors. So, I mean, it's I suppose in those early days, I mean, what was it like in at trying to engage with MSPs and around any of this really?
It was really interesting because actually the first MSPs that Marion and I met were really good. They were really open. And I don't think they'd particularly considered some of this before. And we met Jeremy Balfour, who was one of the Conservative MSPs for the region. And he hosted our first meeting in Parliament. And I think we were quite lucky in Lothian at the time. We also had Andy Whiteman, who is, he and Robin Harper were the only sane Scottish Greens. But of course, Robin Harper had left by that point, but Andy was very good, and so we built a little cohort, and there were others that people have been speaking to, like Jo McAlpine and Claire Baker, and we had a meeting in Parliament a few months rather into our existence, and we had a good turnout, really. And the people who came to that meeting were some of the people who really stuck by it for a long time. There was that core group of Labour women and some of the Conservatives who were worried about it, as well as a couple of SNP and Andy from the Greens. So they were the people who really, we had a bit of support. We didn't have nobody from the government wanted to talk to us, though. That was the issue. And I think we had imagined that we would trot along and say, look, you haven't considered these problems with allowing this self-identification system. And I think we naively thought we'd just point them all out and say, here are a list of all the things that are wrong. And they go, oh, yeah, we hadn't thought of that. And maybe we'll have to consult further. And of course, they just told us to go away. And I understood later that this was because there were certain organisations funded by the Scottish Government floating around the corridors of power, telling ministers that there were only about 4 of us, and that they shouldn't listen to us. We weren't important. We were popular opinion was not on our side, and they should crack on. And those people were in the women's organisations, and I think that's shameful that they were unprepared to listen to what ordinary women, and in some cases their own members, were telling them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I bet they're eating their words now.
I don't think so. I think they're still, I mean, we've not heard much. They've gone quite quiet. We've not heard much from them, but I mean, Engender is still taking over $500,000 a year from the Scottish Government to be sad about the Supreme Court ruling. So,
yeah. So, but of course, you did have a lot of public support because, I and many of my friends were actually at all the demonstrations that were outside Holyrood, and the one I think that where you really began to feel from the outside anyway, was that they were beginning, there were some people, some MSPs listening, was the one where they all came out. Some of them came out to meet with us, but then also there was this, I forget which MSP it was that was complaining that we were making too much noise and we were being,
that was the lovely Karen Adam, I believe.
it was, yes.
Yes.
And we're making, and saying dreadful things that, made her feel unsafe.
Unsafe. She was a victim of domestic violence and she felt unsafe that women were making a noise outside Parliament. I mean,
I know.
Really, it was pathetic. But yes, we had, that meeting was great, and we had a lot of MSPs who were finding their voice, coming out and giving us support. So that was fantastic.
Yeah, it was. So, and then they go for the gender recognition reform and self-identification in a big way. And did you think at the point where they were saying, actually, we're putting this on hold at the moment, did you think that was it going to be brushed under the carpet, or did you think no, they'll come back later, which of course they then did?
They did, and I don't know if they were waiting for some of the rebels to leave, not the rebels, but some of the fiercest opponents to leave, because of course it was originally supposed to be brought in the Parliament that finished in 2021. And of course, in that period, women like Joanne Lamont and Elaine Smith and Jenny Mora for Labour left the Parliament, and the SNP shamefully gerrymandered the election in the south of Scotland to ensure that Joe McAlpine wasn't coming back. And they also gerrymandered their rules to make sure that Joanna Cherry couldn't take the seat in Edinburgh Central. And I wonder whether they were thinking, well, we'll have a slightly more friendly atmosphere in the next Parliament. I mean, little did they know. But I mean, it's certainly the case that I think Labour might have been a bit more wary of whipping that vote if people like Joanne were still there, because obviously she was a former leader and she would have made it very apparent that she was going to rebel. And Elaine and Jenny. So, because in the end it was just Claire and Carol who rebelled against the Labour whip. So I think they were trying to do their sums, and of course Sturgeon stitched it up as well by the Butte House Agreement, because it was an important plank in that agreement as far as the Greens were concerned. They were insisting it had to be brought back. So whatever the concerns within the SNP, and I think there were concerns within the SNP, and that was why it was kicked down the road, Sturgeon was then able to say to her ministers, well, look, I have to do this because the Greens want it. I do think there was a lot of politicking going on, and I think it's shameful because they were trying to do something that they knew the majority of the country weren't in favour of.
Yeah. And then, of course, obviously, eventually the vote came in, but at the same time, what they were doing was this gender representation and trying to sneak in self-ID. And I suppose that's one of the things actually across the whole of Scottish society, is that self-ID is, in organisations, is there, really, isn't it? But this attempt at, so how did Trina think, oh, and did you know that at that point that it would get you to the Supreme Court?
No. In fact, we didn't even know we'd be able to challenge it, because the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act was passed in early 2018. And of course, For Women Scotland was not formed until the 20th of June, 2018. It's our birthday tomorrow. So we weren't in existence when it passed. And Trina was always very aware of it. She was very annoyed about it. But you only have a limited amount of time to challenge legislation. So we felt that it was a bit of a done deal, and this had passed into law in Scotland, and it was very deliberate. It was very deliberate. I mean, when you go back and look at what happened in that process, initially, this was always introduced as a trans-inclusive definition of women. But I think the original definition in the original draft bill was female or people who identified as female. And in the consultation, there was a lot of pushback on that. Interestingly, there was also pushback on that from the trans lobby because they didn't want a legal distinction between female and identify as female. So everybody hated it. So they then said, okay, we'll just put women. We'll just leave it like that because that then conforms to the Equality Act definition. But then in committee, James Morton of Scottish Trans Alliance wanted it made explicit that this was based on self-identification. And so they set out that this was anyone who identified as female. And they didn't have to do anything. They just had to maybe change their name and their pronouns, something to do with utility bills. It was the broadest possible interpretation of self-ID. And the point about it was, for us, was that this was the first time this had ever been set out in law. And I always say this was a massive exercise in hubris and overreach, because if they'd have just left it as woman, I am quite sure that now we would still be in the situation where people from Equality Network and Stonewall were running around the country saying, when they say women, they mean people who identify as women. But there wouldn't have been anything to tie it down. And there was always the reason so-called Stonewall law worked was that there was just enough ambiguity for providers to feel nervous about it. But this was explicit, and it said this is self-ID. So they then consulted on the implementation of it. And that was the point at which we thought, actually, maybe we can use that because it's not been implemented. So we asked Cindy at Balfour Manson. She got Aidan on the case, and they allowed us to take it to judicial review, which was amazing. And Aidan said that, that first judicial review, even though we lost initially, was the easy one, because self-identification was an easy argument to make. This is not the law. This is two protected characteristics that you're conflating. Not only that, but it's half a protected characteristic with gender reassignment, because gender reassignment covers everyone, male and female, but this is only about the male half of it. So he said, it wasn't one in the outer court, but of course it was one in the inner court. And so that was marvelous, because that then proved that all these policies that had been in place for a very long time were completely unlawful. And, well, it should have done, but of course everyone ignored them, as we were to discover.
I know, was that a shock?
No, but it was frustrating how many people just were able to ignore that. And then, of course, the Scottish government came back with another overreach, because they took down that definition, but they introduced statutory guidance saying it's people with a GRC, includes people with a GRC with the female sex, and excludes people with a GRC issued in the male sex. So we thought, well, we have to challenge this, even if we might not win this one, because at the same time, the Gender Recognition Act was passing through Parliament, and they were saying that a GRC was a bit of admin. It just changed your sex for the purposes of birth certificates, marriage certificates, and death certificates. It didn't change your rights under the Equality Act. And yet they had just written into a piece of legislation that having a gender recognition certificate did change your rights for the Equality Act. So we thought, win or lose, we have to challenge this, because otherwise we'd have been stuck with Schrödinger's GRC. That means nothing but means everything. And we'd have had the worst of all worlds, because if the Gender Recognition Act had passed, we would have people running around with these bits of paper saying it changed their rights, and the government on the face of it would be going, no. So we knew that we had to get clarity in the law once and for all at that point. But if they hadn't put that down, we couldn't have done it. So I'd like to thank Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government for creating the environment where we could challenge that.
Do you think there was a naivety on their part or do you think? I mean, it's quite astonishing, isn't it, that they've gone from a position where it could have been nebulous, could have been, something that you couldn't really do anything about, to this point where you actually could do something.
I don't know. I think that at the time they originally did the gender representation on public boards, I think the trans lobby thought they'd won. I think they wanted that in legislation. Alex Cole-Hamilton said at the time, this is just in advance of gender recognition being passed. That's self-ID is what it's going to be. And I think that I do think they were astonished that these scrappy women were going to take them all the way, and that we weren't going to stop. And you said Trina. Trina is forensic. She is one of the most brilliant minds, I think, in Scotland. She should get an honorary law degree at least. And the lawyers agree with that. But she was the person all the time who picked things out. So when we went back to our team, when they changed it and said GRCs, Aidan's first response was, well, that's what everyone thinks the law is, so I'm not sure we can challenge it. And it was Trina who said, no, you have to look at the whole of Section 9, and you have to understand that there has to be a read through across the whole of an act. And so she talked him through this for about half an hour, and then he went, "Ooh, actually, yes, you've got a point."
Well, good for Trina. Yeah. I know, I suppose, I mean, you and I have been at a meeting not that long ago where the civil servants of the Scottish Government said to us that they really thought they were going to win. Which was astonishing, really, because, and actually, I mean, it beggars belief, really, that they were so confident that they were going to win. And that's the impression that they hadn't even considered what they would need to do if they didn't win. Were you as confident you were going to win?
No, I think we wanted to win. We hoped to win. But I think this, again, I find that mind-blowing, because I always say you have to hope for the best but prepare for the worst. Mentally, I was preparing for the worst in advance of the of them handing down the ruling, and we didn't get any advance notice, so we had no clue when we walked into court. And my assessment of it at the time was that if we lost, it would be on the basis that the Parliament had passed this law, but it was a mess, because that was what the EHRC's argument was, that if the Scottish Government's reading of the law was correct, it rendered the Equality Act inoperable in practice. And that was what they'd argued in court. And I thought there was no way that the Supreme Court could have ignored that. So I thought there were two possible outcomes. They would either say, well, no, you cannot pass laws that are internally contradictory and ridiculous. They have to have a consistent read through, and they cannot go against common law or general human rights. Or they would say, well, they passed this law, and so it has to stand, and we accept the Scottish Government and the HRC's reading of it, but it's a terrible, horrible mess. And so Westminster has to go and sort it out. So that was the only way I could think of that we would lose. I didn't think we were going to lose, and they were going to say this is a brilliant piece of legislation. But I prepped for that loss. And so it's interesting. So when people like Jolyon Moore were running around saying that our case was unarguable, well, clearly it was arguable, or we wouldn't have been able to get permission to go to the Supreme Court. And then he was saying we were definitely going to lose. And I thought, well, you haven't actually thought this through. And I do think that this is, for all they will probably say we're in echo chambers, they are in bubbles, and they have got partial information, and they are not thinking intellectually about the arguments or what has been presented, and then they are horrified when people don't conform to their worldviews. So the trans activists really were taken by surprise that they lost. They did not think they would lose. But I think it's very foolish, because I think you always have to think, why would I lose? What are the grounds that I would lose on? And how can I go from there? And we were always quite honest that if we lost, we would be, campaigning at Westminster to change the law. The other side were very much, oh, these terrible people, they just want to force a change in the law. Like, no, we think the law says what we think it says, so we don't want to change the law, but if it doesn't, yeah, we do. And they have done this pivot from it's really evil to want to change the Equality Act to, oh, actually, now the Equality Act says something we don't want it to, we definitely have to change it. So there's a lack of consistency.
There's also been, I suppose, I'm thinking about where we are at the moment with, well, here in Scotland, they're saying, oh, we need to wait for the HRC guidance. There's been a very slow across the UK acceptance that, this is the law and you need to comply with the law. Has that surprised you? Did you think, well, we've got the law right, let's, make sure that the organisations and actually our MSPs, our MPs, our elected representatives will follow the law. Has it surprised you that they've not?
No, not really, because I think there's a level of idiocy at some levels of government and institutions, and a lack of leadership and cowardice that is embarrassing. And the other reason it's not surprised me was because, as I say, we had already proved that self-identification was not lawful. And yet all these organisations have continued since 2022, when we won that case, to have policies based on self-identification. The Sandy Peggy case is case in point, because Dr. Upton does not have a GRC, and they let him into the women's changing room. So there was no excuse for that in law. So they were continuing to disregard the law as it stood at that point. So I am not surprised they are continuing to fight the law as it's been clarified, because if they were all obeying the law, I know the number of people with the GRC has shot up. It's 10,000 now. But if this was only about 10,000 people, it would be really, really easy to sort it out, because that's a tiny, tiny number when spread across the whole of the UK. So you could deal with that in terms of accommodation. So it's not, it's about all the people who've been self-identifying.
Absolutely. So this is going to be my final question just now before we move on to getting questions from our members is obviously there's some issues around appeals to the European Court of Human Rights. And I know that you had a meeting this week in Edinburgh with Sex Matters and the legal representatives from that. And I was wondering what the feeling was about that, and whether or not it's doable, or whether or not it's not something that can happen.
Well, our KC, Aidan, is pretty confident that things like the MacLeod-Whittle case is going nowhere. He said that, for one, the European Court he has done some recent attempts to appeal to the European Court, and he says they are at the moment very reluctant to take cases from the UK, not least because, of course, there's such a feeling against the European Court in the UK. So they don't want to do anything too controversial, and they don't want to tread on toes. And so being asked to challenge the Supreme Court over a rather popular ruling in the UK would probably not go down very well. So he thinks they don't really have the possibility to bring that. Any other case any case really has to exhaust UK options first. And one of the things that was discussed is that if a case is brought on a human rights basis, there are arguments about how far the right to privacy extends to the right to obscure your sex in circumstances where it is pertinent and necessary to disclose your sex. So, there are plenty of circumstances where you can say, no, I'm not telling you my sex or my age or my racial makeup. But in situations where that is pertinent, there are issues about how far you can demand privacy on the basis of human rights for failing to disclose that. And the other thing is that if something were now to go to the European Court on Human Rights, what happened in the past was that that competing human rights were not considered. So when we had Goodwin, there was no consideration given to the rights of women or gay and lesbian people, and or indeed religious minorities. And that would all have to factor in probably now to any case that went there. And so in a way, I think the lawyers were sitting there going, come on, bring it, because then we'll have standards for the human rights of other groups in society who also have these article rights that are potentially going to be that are potentially going to be breached if people are allowed to lie about their sex.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Vicky now, who's going to ask you the questions from our members, and then I'll come back before we finish off. But thank you for that. That was really illuminating.
Thank you, Susan. The first question is, can you tell us how you got to here? What was your journey to becoming part of For Women Scotland, and how did you get there?
Oh, gosh. So I was, got all my information from the BBC and The Guardian, so I hadn't really been aware of a lot of what was going on. And I think the two things that initially piqued my interest, one was a book my daughter was reading about some trans pupils in school. And I had a lot of issues just reading, and I would say at that time I was probably this hadn't even drifted across my radar, but I was very concerned with some of the safeguarding issues that I felt children were being told if they read this book. And then I also, the other thing was that I read a piece by Hadley Freeman. It was the time of the lovely Bruce Jenner becoming Caitlyn Jenner. And when he was declaring that, you know, women were just empty-handed creatures who needed to decide what they had to wear, I thought, well, maybe it's because the women in his life have been empty-headed creatures who only care about what they have to wear. But this is deeply offensive. And so I started to think a little bit more about it. And then I got sucked into the radicalization portal that was Mumsnet. And that was a brilliant resource. I mean, people mock it, but those women in there were so fierce and clever, and they had all the information, the international stats. And so I just sucked it all up. And I got radicalized.
Brilliant, thank you. And what's been the impact of being involved in this on you and your family and friends? And have there been any repercussions in your social circle?
I'm going to touch wood and say that I've been pretty fortunate. My family has been great. You know, I had discussions earlier on with my children, and they were a little bit more hostile initially, but they're fully on board now. I do some stuff in the arts and with younger people. I sometimes wonder if they don't realize this is my alter ego, that I almost wonder if I'm like Bruce Wayne, and because, you know, I don't have my glasses, and I usually have my hair up when I'm doing my dance stuff. So they probably don't realize I'm the same person. But or they think, but she's quite reasonable in person, so that must be a completely different individual. So I have been quite lucky, but I do worry, and I really do worry, especially for the children, and especially, you know, you constantly have this fear of exposure, that someone's going to put your address on the internet, or because some of the messages we get are so vile. And some of the things I've seen people I know say, this is what I mean about my alter ego. Some of the things I've seen people I do know say have been so awful. I think, do they realize that I am that person that they're being abusive about? So yeah, it's interesting. It's not, I haven't suffered in the way other people have. But on the other hand, of course, I didn't have a job. I was about to go back to work. I'm not sure I can ever get a job anywhere else, even though I probably need one, because I'm not sure how this is the single biggest achievement of my life. But if I put this on my CV, you know, am I even going to get in the door? So.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. The next question is, why did this issue, what is it about Scotland? Why did it take such a hold in Scotland in particular?
Yeah, that's I've said there's going to be books written about this. So Scotland is a small country, and it's always easier to effect an institutional capture in a small country. Scotland has had an LGBT machine for much longer than the rest of the UK. So Equality Network, LGBT youth, been going since the 80s or 90s, on the basis that all these characteristics were lumped in, and they've been pushing on it. Scotland has been, I would say, trans-central for quite a long time. There was big, in one of the hospitals in Scotland, there were quite a number of young people who went into the hospital for other psychological issues who came out trans. And that was going on way, way, way before this had become social contagion in the way that it has now. So I think when you've got a small country, people know each other and they feed into that. you just need a couple of well-respected big names to really push on something. And we had Tim Hopkins, who is very well respected in the Equality Network, who had done all the work on equal marriage in Scotland, and before that, decriminalisation of homosexuality. He was very young at that point, but he was campaigning on that. And they set up Equality Network and then Scottish Trans Alliance. James Morton in Scottish Trans Alliance was a real player. So, and if you read Trans Britain, you will see how they worked on things like the Scottish Prison Service back in the day. And it's very explicit. They use the words "we strategized," because they knew that if they got the prison service, they could then turn around to the women's shelters and say, well, if they can do it in the prison service, there's no problem. And that was exactly what they did. And so in about 2013, you have Scottish Trans Alliance going around the rape crisis centres, educating them on how to manage trans women. And of course, you know, most of the people working in there at that time, they're very well-meaning. They are very dedicated to eradicating violence. They get somebody in there who says this is terribly persecuted minority. And obviously, you don't have to give them the same services, but let's just think about how you can include them in some way in your services. And so then the Scottish government started demanding a trans inclusion policy. And so in order to get funding, and so then these services were trying to work this through. And you know, I don't like using the term boiling a frog, because actually you can't boil a frog. So, but it was like that in the urban myth version, that it was very incremental, that you start off saying, we've got these vulnerable people, can you help them? And then it just keeps moving to, well, why aren't they in the mainstream service? Why can't they be in your shelters? Why can't you? And the more embedded these people were in mainstream Scottish life, the harder it is then to say, actually, no, we don't think this is appropriate. Small countries are always more liable to capture. And as the Dentons report, that made it absolutely clear, you go for the smaller countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people are commenting in the chat that Wales is a bit, that they recognise that from Wales as well. The next question is, do you think that further legal action will be necessary? A number of people in the chat are saying that their employers, what they're saying is, we're waiting for further guidance, we're waiting, and they aren't yet complying. How are we going to make them comply?
Yeah, we've been back and forwarding on this. We met the EHRC last week, and Mary was there, and they have said in terms, this is the law, and duty bearers have to obey the law as it is now. There are a lot of people, including the Scottish government, running around saying, we have to wait for guidance. They don't have to wait for guidance. They need to act now. But this is their fig leaf. I think to an extent, it might be difficult to press before the guidance, because they are kicking the can down the road, obviously, but they will spin it out and make that excuse. I think if the Scottish government, for example, do not take steps soon to withdraw some of the clearly unlawful guidance, there is the possibility of further legal action. I think the other thing is that individuals will have cases, and they may have class action cases. So, for example, if there are women in prisons who have suffered because there are still men in prisons in Scotland and they shouldn't be there. They are going to be able to bring a case against the Scottish ministers. And if they haven't acted to move these men as a matter of urgency, then they stand to get greater reparation for that. And I think, sadly, it will involve more individuals taking cases, and that's going to be difficult. But that's where the fund that J.K. Rowling has established comes in helpful, because if you've got a case, you can go, and it's very difficult to take a case, and I do understand that. But in a way, there's only so much we can do with judicial reviews, because the organisations have to feel the heat and the financial heat of failing to abide by these laws. So I think that yes, there may be more legal cases, and the EHRC will intervene now on our side. It was interesting today because there were questions of the Scottish parliamentary body that sort of manages the parliamentary estate, not government buildings, but the parliamentary estate. And they are MSPs, but they were clearly advised straight away, no, you have to have male, female, biologically female, and a third space. And that's what they did. And of course, Patrick Harvey's thrown all his toys out of the pram. And they were very robust again today in Parliament, saying, we're not moving on this. This is the law. We've been told this is the law. So we're adhering to the law. And I think more organisations have to do that. The Scottish government were claiming they were nervous they'd get sued. But I think they should be more nervous about being sued by the people who have the law on their side rather than the people who don't.
Yeah. Any idea when the final guidance will be out?
No, I mean, the consultation finishes on 30th of June, and everybody should put something in, please, because, it's not going to change anything, but I think it's useful for them to say we've had a lot of positive responses, and there are areas that need to be tightened up on the examples. So they are saying that they will read everything. They intend to do it thoroughly, but they are hoping to turn it around swiftly. Once it goes to the minister, it has to be laid before Parliament, and then it has to sit for 40 days. And during that time, there can be a challenge to it. And if there isn't a challenge, then it becomes statutory. So it's not going to happen until well after the recess. It may be about November.
Okay. So so there may be people taking cases in the meantime because of things that are happening to them at work or in prisons or wherever. Just one more question, then I'll hand back to Mary. Can you tell us what's next for you in terms of campaigning? And people are saying, are you thinking of going into politics, Susan? And in terms of your other life, your real life, what's next for you?
My real life. I mean, I think we have to keep going. I don't think we can stop. I think all this resistance to the rulings made it clear we can't stop. We've run for Women Scotland as a sort of voluntary organisation for 7 years. And I said, it hadn't affected my personal relations too much, but it certainly had an impact on my financial status. And I think that we will have to professionalize to an extent, because I don't think it's sustainable. But equally, I now feel very strongly that we can't stop. We can't just say, well, we've won it, we'll back out, because, as you say, it's clear there are a lot of people who aren't going to obey the law. And if we're not there to hold their feet to the fire, I don't know what they'll do. People have asked us about politics. We've talked about it. The issue I have with that is that we ran our campaign, we always ran our campaign as a very broad church, and we have members from across the political spectrum. And I would not want to sacrifice that. So any political campaign we were to run would have to be very neutral on a lot of things. And of course, in Scotland, the Constitution's a big issue, and we've always been neutral on that. We might get some seats, and it would be a bit tight. There's an election next year in Scotland. But I am concerned that in Parliament, you don't actually have that much power. I think we have managed to do more from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you see that with some of the really brilliant politicians we've worked with. If they're one voice in a Parliament and they are not in government, they do not have that power. So I think we've been able to do more outside and pushing the politicians than we would do inside.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to hand over back to Mary. Thank you, Susan.
Pleasure.
I think that's a really interesting point you make about our politicians, isn't it? And I think the other thing about them is that we assume that they're knowledgeable. And actually, sometimes they're not. And I guess that's been seen many times in Scotland, but also was saw recently at the Select Committee at Westminster, where the Baroness Kitchener was there. So I think you're right about that bit about, continuing to try and drive change from out with that system. What do you think then on that is the one thing that we could be taking up as a network in terms of trying to what's the most important, if you're able to say, of course, the most important priority that we would like to see shift and change in?
I think one of the things that it's difficult, right? Because the minute we lost, that galvanizes the people on the other side. Sorry, the minute we won, the minute they lost, it galvanizes those people to come onto the streets, show of force, big numbers, holding up their signs saying kill TERFs, whatever it was they were saying. And I am sure they're all besieging their MSP's offices. It's much easier to mobilize people when they are angry about something. So I think we need to realize we still need to let our politicians know and everybody else know in workplaces, the NHS, that we are still here and we are not going away. So I think it's really important, critically important, that we keep reminding them that that yes, they may be getting a lot of very angry men at the moment knocking on their doors, but they cannot give in to them because there are far more angry women who will come back after them if they slide. And I think because there are so many people saying they're not going to obey the law and companies not doing any, I think we do need to probably find those cases. And as I say, I think it probably will have to be individuals. I think we will have to find those cases and take those cases. And that will be difficult for individuals and they will need support. And then beyond that, it's about being in the seats of power, because organisations like ours and like we've been reluctantly invited to the table for the past few years. But one thing we were discussing with Aidan, the Scottish government has funded people under various income streams that are supposed to represent all the protected characteristics. They don't, because the organisations they have funded that represent gay and lesbian people are all LGBT. So they do not represent gay and lesbian people who don't believe that sex is mutable. and all the women's organisations they have funded are also people who deny that sex is an absolute category in the law, and they've rolled it over. So we've always had we don't want to be a Scottish Government patsy. We don't want to turn into Engender, but equally, we do not think that the Scottish Government should be funding organisations that are not willing to obey the law. And we think that that is something that we will need to keep pushing on, that if these organisations are explicitly saying, as some of the rape crisis centres still saying our women-only services are open to trans women and non-binary people. Well, no, if it's women only, it's women only. And if you are not doing it right, you can still offer services to other people. But if they're women only, you obey the law. And if you don't obey the law, you don't get our public money.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the funding of, and I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, well, they did tell us that we were stakeholders now. So maybe we are entitled to some funding.
And we should be at that table all the time, all the time, and not just as an add-on or an afterthought. We have to be, we have to be there.
So we really need to just keep up the pressure in a range of ways. And actually the clear message is you need to follow the law. And thank you very much for all the work that you've done. I say this on behalf of all of us for, making sure that the law is very clear and that we can now say you need to follow the law with absolute confidence.
Thank you so much for joining us, Susan. It's been fantastic to hear from you.
That's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and tap the bell to make sure you don't miss new content. Sign up to our newsletter at www.womensrights.network, and if you're interested in becoming a member, click on the Join Us link.